Hello and welcome to another video from GM Runs Game. In this video we're going to look at the alien role-playing game scenario Chariots of the Gods and how we can modify it to make sure we can run it in a one-shot, whether that's at a convention or with your friends around the tabletop. So during the video we're going to be looking at a couple of the key points. We'll be looking at player characters to find out, depending on how many people are making up your group, which player characters are better to go for. Although you still really want to give your group the choice, we're going to be looking at the non-player characters that the group will encounter during the mission, which of those again are key and need to be emphasized, and those that should have more supporting roles. We're going to look at the structure of the entire session, as well as the key locations that are going to be driving the plot throughout the scenario. And then we'll have a little bit more of a look at each of the acts in a little bit more detail, so we can go into the nitty-gritty and start planning out where these key events need to be happening, and give a little bit of room for your players to play around in the sandbox. So first, let's take a look at the player characters. We want to make sure that everybody's got a choice in who they play, but these are just recommendations to make sure that you've got a balanced set of skills depending on the number of people you've got playing in your game. So if you've got 3 players playing in the game, which is probably the minimum I would suggest you play with, it's really important for the structure of the group that you have both Miller and Wilson, that's the officer and the company agent, and then there's an option you can have either Cham or you can have Rye. Those are your 2 roughnecks. They're basically either mechanics or really spec'd into communication. Both of those can be quite important during this scenario, and there are certain times in this game where you need your pilot to make pilot rolls, particularly towards the beginning and the end of the session. So Davis you should control as an NPC, but you can have your players make those roles and just declare what that character is doing when they're not active within the group. So you should have then your officer, your company agent, and one of the 2 roughnecks with Davis still with you. You can leave the other roughneck on the first ship that you're going to be on in this mission if you want to, or perhaps the pilot can do that role as well. Now if you're going to have 4 players, it sort of ratchets up. So now you have 4 players, some of the key stuff you're going to be doing, which is why we have Davis the pilot as an NPC that the player can sort of dip in, dip out of when there's only 3 of them. It's good then to have Miller, Wilson and Davis being played by player characters, and then also have a choice between either your communications or your heavy machinery specs roughnecks. You can have both of those characters still appearing, or one of those characters still appearing as NPCs with you, that the players can control, or you can just sort of say they're doing this and that, much the same as you would with Davis if there was 3 players, because as we've touched on, a lot of this is going to be about timing and about making sure that the story makes sense instead of getting too bogged down in the detail of the actual scenario. Then obviously if you have your 5 players, you have all of your characters represented. So you have Miller, you have Wilson, you have Rye, Cham, and you have Davis, and you'll find that throughout the course of the missions, throughout the 3 or 4 hour session that you have, hopefully 4 if you're trying to do this in one session, each of those characters will sort of come in and then go back out again depending on what tasks are the most pressing at the time, and playing it with 5 players whilst really good, because you get to see all of that, presents the most challenging option for timings, but it can be quite good as well because they feel comfortable normally at about that level. Splitting up 4 and 5 character parties are more likely to split up, which in a survival horror game of course is exactly what you want to happen. Okay, next let's take a look at the NPCs that you're going to encounter during the course of this scenario. They form two main camps. So the full complement of NPCs includes Johns, Ava, Clayton, Reed, Flynn and Cooper. There are a couple of these characters, namely Flynn and Reed, who are supporting characters, and if you have any deaths, any player deaths throughout this scenario, can quickly be subbed in. You can do that really with all of them, but the medic and the marine are 2 roles that we don't have represented in the player character careers, so they'll give another flavour of what people can do. They also provide, for example, the medic can also provide some NPC healing of player characters when you encounter these non-player characters. Then you've got Johns, Clayton and Cooper. These 3 NPCs really are plot devices that drive the story forward, and they need to be given a bit more time when you're encountering them. These need to be your 3 points of references, the 3 conversations that are happening, the 3 loudest voices. And lastly, you've got Ava, who of course is a synthetic that the players can meet prior to the cryo bay, and Ava really is there for expedition. So she's going to give your player characters additional information, maybe before they meet Cooper and Clayton, or perhaps afterwards if there's some of the information that they're being given, which we'll cover, won't necessarily be all of the information or might not be totally honest. Then Ava is able to provide a scientific fact by fact list of events that have taken place that can start bringing some doubt into the player characters' minds. If you've got all the time in the world, if you've got a couple of sessions, by all means read and dive into all of these characters. If you don't have a couple of sessions and you're really trying to get this done in one session, then Reed and Flynn should be there for function more than anything else. Like I said, they're there to be replacement player characters that the player characters can put their own stamp onto. If they're really getting their butts kicked, you can get some actual weaponry in there, and you can also get some medic stuff in there in order to keep them alive and keep them going to the end of the scenario. The only other real option there is Ava. So while I've got her listed under the essentials because of that additional information, and because she calls into doubt the information that Cooper is giving you, or the motives of Clayton or Johns, she's not actually essential. I've run this scenario where Ava hasn't been encountered, and I've just sort of moved her to the side and kept her quiet. She's quite useful towards the end of the first and middle of the second hour to drop a little bit more information about the Cronus as the characters are starting to think about fixing the core functions of the vessel before they get the information that Mother's waking up and there are in fact survivors in the cryo bay. Okay, so now we've looked at the player characters, the non-player characters, and how those parties are made up depending on how many people you have or how much time you have. Now we're going to look at the scenario structure. Split that across the timelines, so each hour here has got its own tracker. I've also split it into the acts that we should be covering in those hours. The first act being taking place over the first 2 hours because there's a lot of expedition there, there's a lot of information, and we're also changing location there. The second act being between the second and the third hour, and the third act being between the third and the fourth hour, and that's going to tie a lot of things up as you look at the personal agendas that all of the characters have. So let's just run through this quickly. So when we're starting, we're going to read the introduction, the player's introduction to the scenario. They're going to want to have some food like at the start of the Alien movie, and then they're going to want to head to the bridge. So when they get to the bridge, you're going to read off ping, the event ping, which is a ship, a sensor has gone off alerting you to a ship within the proximity of your vessel. Now that could be any number of things. It can be something that's expected as you approach Sutter's world. It could be something unexpected. They don't know, so they're going to have a look into that. They'll find that there's nothing there, it was a false reading, and you'll move on to nobody's home. So now they're engaging with the sensors of the Montero. No one's home. Nobody's home is going to be about trying to contact Sutter's world, or trying to contact the point of contacts there so that they can dock and they can unload their cargo. They're going to see that there's no Sutter's world. They're in fact in deep space, and it's at this point that you want to allow a little bit of time for the characters to process that information as the setting now starts to come into the foreground. Then you have a choice between New Orders and Ghost Ship. New Orders essentially is saying there's a vessel that's moving with inertia through our close space, and we need to, based on old maritime law, based on company rules, we need to investigate it, and we're being compelled to investigate it. Ghost Ship basically says something similar, except the ping is now linked to that vessel. So we've had another ping, and now we can see that although there is nothing that we could detect earlier because there's no power or there's no exterior lights on, there is in fact a shape moving through space close to the Montero. Based on new orders, the party or the captain is going to be told that there's a list of priorities that Mother has. We're going to hand out to the captain. What I like to do is prepare a little handout with Mother's information so that Miller can communicate that to the crew, to your player characters, and we'll then talk through Ghost Ship. Well, sorry, not new orders. We'll talk about the priorities and the salvage operation that we need to conduct. The priorities are as follows. Priority number 1 is recover any scientific data and specimens. Priority number 2 is to escort this ship to a Weyland-Yutani facility, the nearest one being Anchorhead, but we can go to any. And point number 3 is to save crew members on board the Cronus. Now, that's an order of importance. So that's the priority order from Weyland-Yutani. And we then move to boarding party. Boarding party is it's how we're going to interact with this vessel. So either we catch up with it, we take the Daisy, which is like a small vessel that we've got on the Montero, a cargo loader. We set up a umbilical cord between the two ships, or we spacewalk onto the new ships. But we'll need our pilot at this point to draw us in close to match the speed and to match the coordinates that the Cronus, or we'll soon to discover the Cronus, is moving towards. And the players will then have to decide what they want to do, and they'll have to then make some rolls and interact to get from the Montero onto the Cronus. And it's important at this point that you ask them, is everybody going? Who's staying? We need to get into a little bit more detail now because we're sort of done with the intro fluff, and now we're getting into some of the more key mechanics of the session. That's generally where hour 1 will end. You're going to have a little bit of time at the beginning where people are getting to know each other, or they're making alien jokes, which is cool, and then you're going to dump this information. In most scenarios, the player characters will overanalyze the first few bits of information, so just keep going with the alerts from Mother. Let them decide what they're trying to do when you're giving them the information about the ping and then nobody's home, and then when it feels appropriate between nobody's home and new orders or Ghost Ship, that's when you want to step in and say, Mother is now trying to communicate with Officer Miller about the happenings in the space surrounding the Montero. Exofoot and the Headless Man. These are two hints at what's going to be coming. One, the Exofoot literally is going to be like small pores, small eggs that, if they're disturbed, they're going to release particles into the air. Headless Man similarly is going to be an abomination, a dead abomination that the players are going to find, and it's going to amp up a little bit of stress on the characters. And those two, don't be too hard on where you're putting them. Obviously we need to be on the Cronus for that, but you can play around with those as and when you feel the story needs a little bit more action. Once the characters are able to identify that the vessel is the Cronus, have the Montero Mother be able to access the schematics from records, because the Cronus is a very old ship. Have them be able to access those schematics and give the schematics to the players, so they now have a map to work from. They're going to have a map of the entire Cronus that they can work from. Let them get onto the Cronus and let them explore. Give them a little bit of time here just to decide where they're going to want to go. Probably they're going to want to either head towards the bridge, they're going to want to head towards Mother, they're going to want to try and interact with some of the core functions of the Cronus to get more information, because we've sort of led them so far along the path, but we haven't actually given them sort of clear facts about what's going on here and why the Cronus is in this condition. And when they start going along that line, that's when you can trigger Mother to awake. Mother's going to come online, reactors are going to power up, the life support is going to come on, there's going to be a whole heap of noise coming from the air scrubbers, the air purifiers, but it's not all going to be working properly. It's sort of almost like when you turn a key in your ignition and the engine's sort of really struggling and choking, but not fully functioning. At this point, you want to read out the warning, or I would suggest you read out the warning from Sleep of Ages. So as a result of Mother waking up, you're going to say, warning, cryo chambers deactivated. Warning, cryo chambers deactivated. And that's going to remind them that their third priority is to go and interact with these crew and to try and save those who are still alive. Let them play with that a little bit. Let them get further and deeper into the Cronus, to the point that it's going to be a real effort to head back to the Montero. And when you get to that point, that's when I like to hit T-minus 10 minutes, which is, of course, the Montero Mother coming across their communications saying displacement drive malfunction, critical failure, and explaining that the vessel is going to essentially explode within 10 minutes, and really push that countdown. You want that 10 minutes to be felt, even if it isn't 10 minutes. If we resolve everything here within 5 minutes, or if we resolve everything within 15 minutes, as they're talking and as they start panicking about what they want to do and how they want to process that information, you just need to repeat displacement drive malfunction, T-minus 7 minutes, and really apply the stress outside of the game mechanics onto the player characters and make them make a decision. Are they going to go back and try and save it? Are they going to try and detach it from the Cronus? What are they going to do? How are they going to react to this compelling countdown and this impeding doom of their getaway vessel, of their original vehicle, which they will now know, of course, they're in deep space. They're pretty far from any worlds, and they have a choice to make between trying to save the Montero, which can be catastrophic, or being aboard a vessel that's been floating in space for decades. How will they react to that? Generally, it'll play out a little bit longer now. Once they've made that decision, the Montero will either be cut off or the Montero will explode, and they'll turn their attentions to where they can get more information aboard the Cronus. And where they can get more information is from the cryobase. So they'll usually head to the cryobase at this point, and they'll have Dr. Cooper. He'll be complaining about having headaches. He'll be trying to remember bits and pieces because he's going to have some amnesia. In fact, they all will have some amnesia from being in cryosleep for so long, and he'll begin muttering nonsense, and eventually, as you play it out and you let a crescendo build, he'll begin to have a seizure. At this point, a bloodburster is born and will literally burst out of his body and will attack the closest PC. This should be the first time that the player characters get hands-on with the combat. As soon as the bloodburster takes any damage, or if we roll the attack on the signature attack of the bloodburster that causes it to flee, that bloodburster will flee. And we want the bloodburster to survive here. We want to soft launch almost combat. You want to run them through initiative. You want to run them through fast, slow actions. Run them through zones. Give them options. Make them assess the situation before that bloodburster disappears through an air shaft or disappears through a drainage grate before, after 5 more minutes or 10 more minutes, that bloodburster will then start to hunt the party, and they're then going to have a juvenile xenomorph. It will have grown substantially in that short period of time, and it will then start to hunt them. And that's where we'll end hour number 2. So we then go into act number 2 at the beginning of hour number 3. As you'll notice, between act 1, 2 and 3, the number of prompts we're giving and the number of events is lessening, and that's because there are personal agendas that during each act, or at the end of each act, players will be given new cards, and that will push those personal agendas forward. I'm not going to go into that just in case you're a player, but each of those create a really compelling story by the end of it, given the backdrop, which is the scenario structure here, and all these events that happen throughout the different acts. So we need to allow more time in Act 2, and Act 3 is almost totally free unless you want to add the Satillo in there, which in a one shot is nearly impossible to do and land with any real feeling that it should be there. It kind of can feel shoehorned in, so just let it breathe and let the players decide what they want to do. It is perfectly possible that people can survive on the Cronus. Now, it's super unlikely, but this is a one shot, so people go into this scenario with an expectation that maybe they were not going to live, or maybe some of them are going to live, and that's fine. So going into Act 2, we're going to start off with partial truths. So you've got Dr. Cooper, who's just been convulsing and having a seizure. John will start coming a bit too. He'll start remembering more about the Cronus and its scientific mission. Clayton's going to jump in and say it was an architectural mission. You know, the old ruins. We were sent there to learn about an old civilization. Everybody has been inoculated based on some sort of contagion that we found there, and they don't understand what's happened to Dr. Cooper and why he had this seizure and what's come out of him. Players are going to want to search him, and they're going to find in his pocket Dr. Cooper's inoculation. Flynn will tell everybody that there are more inoculations in the med bay, and that for those who've taken their masks off or those who've taken any damage, it's going to be a good idea to get them to the med bay and inoculate them before the spores that are in the air here have the same effect on the players as they've had on Dr. Cooper. We'll then go to bad air. So bad air and is really about the air scrubbers, and there's events that happen in the air scrubbers that are quite compelling. And John's just going to recommend that the air scrubbers need to be changed in order to try and get rid of the contaminants and get rid of the spores in the air, or lessen their effect, even though some players will have been inoculated, some don't always want to be inoculated, and that's a nice little thing to do once we've reached a point where some are saying yes and some are saying no to the inoculation, and some have taken it and some haven't taken it. You say, okay, well then the only other thing we can do is try and sort out the air scrubbers, so let's go to the air scrubbers. And whilst we're doing that, if we're trying to get this vessel right, let's have a look at change of plans, which we hinted at in Act 1, and now we can hint at it again. And change of plans, like Egg Sack's foot and the Headless Man, is something that you can move around as and when you feel it's needed. But essentially it's saying you're stuck on the Cronus, or your second priority is to bring the Cronus back to anchor point. So we need to sort out the comms array, we need to change the filters on the air scrubbers, and we also need to look at the engines, which, if you're playing this over a couple of sessions, has a couple of stages to it. You know, you're actually going into the engines, you're looking at the reactor core. If you're doing it as a one shot, just play it as a reactor. Just play the reactor core part of that. There's an encounter there which is really good fun, and it takes a little bit of the legwork away that's not really needed to land the story. Then we have a look at things like aggressive tendencies and infected, which are those who've had the inoculations in the crew, and the player characters will start to become a little bit more agitated. It's easier to play this out as crew members, but you can pick a player character or two player characters if everyone's still there, and you can start having them act out slightly more aggressive tendencies as they start to mirror what Dr. Cooper saw. Don't be too on the nose with this though. You want this to be subtle. You want it to form part. You can hand these cards out when you're reviewing the personal agenda cards. You want to be a lot more subtle with this, and you want people to be able to choose how they role play it out. The NPCs can be way more on the nose with this stuff, but the player characters, you want to keep it nice and subtle so people don't know what's occurring. One thing you can do as well with Ava, Ava's not in any of these acts that I've put here. You can have Ava appear, or you can have the players find Ava. Once they do, they essentially have to fix her, and they have to earn her trust. Once they've done that, Ava will then tell them some truths about the inoculations. She'll tell the truths about the archaeological dig that the Cronus went to, and the artifacts that they found there, and that they were weapons, and those weapons were the spores, the xenomorphs, and that they are on the Cronus, and that will start the players to really panic. Once we get to this point and we go into Act 3, there are things you can do here. There are events that can take place, but at this point I tend to take the foot right off the gas with the events, and I let the players take the story, really from when they start to get Mother of All Headaches and Partial Truths, which is a lot of the information about the scenario, a lot of the setting, more than you wake up on a ship and there's another ship nearby. Now you start to see what happened on the other ship from that point on, and with the personal agendas. I really like to let the players take the story forward, so that's where we'll leave the scenario structure. So now that's the structure covered, let's look at some of the key locations that the players are going to be visiting throughout the scenario. Highlighted first in green, these are the key locations that change of plans will highlight. So you've got the reactor relay control, which is where they're going to be able to try and start to get full power back to the engines. You've got the air scrubber shafts, where they can enact more purification on the air. They can remove the spores that are in the air and try and make it way more breathable than when they first came here, and from when Mother awakes. And then you've got the bridge, where you've got the comm station, where they can try and call for help. You've got some security information there as well. You've got loads of systems that the players can interact with, but they're not going to be able to get to the bridge until they have gone to the cryo base. The air scrubber shaft they can get to, but they probably aren't really going to be prompted to be doing that until they've interacted with the NPCs. And the reactor relay control, occasionally the Roughnecks will want to go there fairly early, and it's okay to let them do that. You can run it as Mother awakes when they interact with the reactor relay control, and just have a little bit more power come online with the lighting and stuff like that. The other locations that we will be going to in this scenario, the cryo base, that's their third priority, to save the crew, and they'll be triggered to go there when Mother awakes and says that the cryo base are deactivating, because all the players here are going to want to try and control the situation. So if there are things that are alive on this ship, and they potentially have information, they're going to want to go there, they're going to want to interact with them, get that information, and make judgments based on that. You've got the med lab, where Flynn is going to tell them to go to get the inoculations. Lots of fun, cool stuff is happening there. And then you have the science lab. We won't talk about what's in the science lab, but they'll end up in the science lab at some point or another. Those are the key locations that when you're looking at your book and you're trying to read stuff out, these are the ones that you want to have either printed out separately so that you can access it quickly, or the ones that you want to spend more time preparing because you know that they're going to be where more time is going to be spent. There's lots of corridors here. There's lots of sort of office rooms or pilot rooms or what have you, mess halls, and those are fine and good. And my suggestion would be that when you go through the book, maybe you highlight the sections that you want to read to the players, because the blurb is written in such a way that you've got to be a little bit on it to make sure you're not oversharing. So either highlight the bits that you're willing to read to the players, and then the GM instructions, leave those not highlighted, separate those two somehow. But in terms of the places that you want to really cover and know what's happening before you sit down at the table, these would be the 6 that I would suggest. I'm sure there's probably 1 or 2 that I've missed off. But in terms of story beats, this is where a lot of the stuff is going to be happening. Now looking at Act 1 into more detail, and we won't spend too much time doing this because the video is getting a little bit long at this point, but we'll break it down act by act. So your Act 1 priorities, this is what going into and going through Act 1 you need to make sure that you're landing. The first thing is that you're setting the scene, and that's from the introduction. When you're saying that there's a ping and there's nothing there, when you're saying nobody's home around Sutter's World, when you're giving the information about the new orders in the ghost ship, when you're telling the crew that there's a couple of options, or they're figuring out that there's a couple of options of how to get from the Montera to the Cronus, who's dishing out the gear, who's dishing out the weaponry. Captain Miller is dishing out the weaponry because Captain Miller is in charge. All of this, you want to set that scene and let your players breathe in there. When they see the egg sacs, or if you're using the headless man, when Mother awakes and bang, the lights come on, or more lights come on. When that T-minus 10 minutes come on, it needs to cut through those players and it needs to grab their attention like it would if you were in that situation. As well as when you have the change of plans, and when you have the mother of all headaches and the alien, the bloodburster finally comes from Dr. Cooper. All of that really relies on you setting that scene and you telling the players what's around them so they can decide how they want to react and how they want to behave based on that. The next thing you want to do, and as part of that, you want to create the mystery. This is really important when you're talking about the negative space throughout this scenario. So when there's nothing there on the ping, I'm not going to go through the list again, but there's nothing there on the ping. When there's, what else have we got? The headless man. When there's the ghost ship, when they get the information about the inoculations, set the mystery, and just let the players tug at the thread, giving a little bit more information each time, and let them start buying into the story. Really, you want them by the end of the first hour to have settled into what they're doing. And then throughout the second hour, you want them to start picking the story and becoming invested in the actual storytelling. Because from the start of hour 2 to the end of hour 3, that's when a load of story is happening, and it's going to inform how they want to act when they get to hour 4. Then we want to make sure that the company rules are rigid. So I referenced earlier maritime rules. If there's an issue, if there's a mayday in our world, and there's a vessel at sea, I'm almost certain that people are compelled legally to go and give aid, stop what they're doing if they're within a certain amount of distance or what have you. Make them hear that. So when I run this campaign, I reference those maritime rules. Space is vast, like our ocean is vast compared to the ships that we have in our ocean. So space is vast. If there's a ship that's moving through space only traveling with inertia, there's no exterior lights on, these things are bizarre, they're odd, and they're not how they should be. They are morally obligated, and even if they have no morals, they are obligated by the ruling of the company that they investigate and they try and restore the vessel's functions. They try and reclaim the resources it has, and they try and learn what's gone on to cause this, so that next time lives aren't put at risk or lives aren't lost. You really need to make sure that when you're landing the new orders from Mother, that and then you'll hear the players referencing that and echoing that throughout the scenario. When you're landing that, it needs to be rigid and it needs to be compelling. And then let them feel the risk. Let all the players feel the risk. When you're talking about moving from the Montero to the Cronus, take a minute and describe what happens as they're moving across the umbilical. If they're spacewalking it, take a minute and just describe, are you double checking that you're hooked up? Are you making sure you're hooked up? The response will always be, yeah, I'm going to double check, I'm going to make sure. But when you're saying that, you're putting that moment of doubt in the player's mind that goes, something could happen here. And in Alien, and in this survival horror where apart from the little bubble the players are in, the rest of it needs to be fairly dark. It's all those little doubts, they add up. And like I said earlier, it's about making your player characters through the characters that they're playing feel the stress. Obviously, you don't want to go too crazy on this because everybody's a person, and you don't want people in real life to feel stressed to a level that's not going to be acceptable during a game. But if there are moments that you can make people go, "Oh, I don't like that," and then they look at their player character and they decide how that player might react to that, that's okay. It's okay to do that. So let the players feel the risk of what they're doing. The captain picks up the weapons that he's able to hand out before going on the Cronus and takes a moment as they look at the crew and decide who should have what. Why should that person have those weapons? And think, how are those players feeling when they've been told that they're not getting a weapon and the other players are getting the weapon? Because we all have meta information about the Aliens universe. We know it's dangerous, we know what's in there. Their player characters don't. But there's going to be a subconscious level of, well, I wanted the weapon. And now if I find myself alone, what will I do? As we've covered before, the structure of Act 2 is about partial truths. It's about the bloodburster coming into the story. It's about bad air and the air scrubbers being looked at if they haven't already. It's going to be about the change of plans and fixing the comms array, fixing the reactor core. It's going to be about infected and non-player characters starting to behave more aggressively towards each other before actually just starting to fight with people, whether that's other non-player characters or player characters, as well as player characters' behaviour starting to change if any of them have become infected by removing their visors and breathing in the spores aboard the Cronus. And the main priorities we want to take from this is that we want to continue to tease the mystery. So we learn more from Dr. Cooper and then we lose Dr. Cooper. We learn more from Johns and then Clayton starts interrupting Johns and then Flynn tells us to go to the medical bay. So lots of things are happening quickly, but we're not getting that additional depth of information that's allowing us to go, okay, this is what's happened, this is how we're going to react. It's always that little bit too shallow, the information, to make us go, okay, so this is the story, so let's go and do it. So you want to continue to tease that information until things really start to kick up and blow up, and you'll know when it's right, or if it's right, to introduce Ava and introduce the scientific facts of the situation and the desperation that says the Cronus went there to get some artifacts. Those artifacts are on board, and those artifacts are very much alive, as well as the second priority being the Bloodburster being born. So we'll probably, by this point, we'll have been dealing with abominations, we'll have dealt with a small Bloodburster coming out of Dr. Cooper, and then we get to deal with the juvenile neomorph, which you can see in the picture here, coming back 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later, whenever you feel it's right, but coming back to then put the pressure right back on the players. So this crazy thing has happened, it's gone away after it's been attacked and taken damage, or after it's rolled its attack and it's told the attack it's rolled is told it to run away, it disappears. The players start catching their breath, and then as soon as the players start moving again, or enough time passes if they want to stay in the same location, that Bloodburster, which has turned into a juvenile neomorph, starts coming back, starts hunting them, and it's nastier. And when you're describing it, you're describing how elongated its skull is, how much larger this is than you would have seen it before, and how short a period of time has passed between those two sightings, and call into question whether it even is the same thing, or if it isn't the same thing, and have them all really start to guess what's happening here, and start to feel all those sort of truths that they know, all their reference points of their reality start to be called into question, and they are left with the only options they have, which is act, see what happens, react, act, see what happens, react, act, see what happens, and so on and so forth. And when they get into that fight or flight, when they get into that tunnel vision, that's when the stress mechanic can come in and stuff can get really, really interesting in this scenario. And then we have Act 3. Act 3 has got a couple of different events that you can run, but essentially they're conclusions that you can reach. And I've listed 3 major priorities for this act. The first one is Chaos Ensues. So at this point, each of the characters' personal agendas have now fully developed. They've read the end game of their personal agendas, and they're going to more than likely be leaning into these now as the story takes hold of them and their characters. And it's really important that you let that happen. So if they're trying to do something that seems odd to you, you let it play out, and you will get the reward back, and the group after the fact will be able to pick it apart, and they'll have the sort of wow moment, the curtains, opening moments when they start to see all the reasonings for all the things each of the players have done. As part of that, you need to be flexible. I've had people lock themselves in the bridge. I've had people jump on the Daisy that's been brought over. Lucas, I've had him jump on the Daisy with another crew member, and they've left the Cronus behind. And as the Daisy's drifted off, one crew member has died while Lucas is sat there being an android surviving until he's picked up however many hundreds of years down the line. Be flexible with the ending. Trust now in your player characters. You've given them the structure, you've given them the story, you've given them the environment, you've given them the threats. Now let's give them the story. Let them tell their story. A lot of the Alien RPG is based around you creating situations and players telling you how they're going to act in those situations. So now we're in the end game of that. So what they want to do, you need to try your best to let them try to do them. Now it's not, they won't all work out. Some of them are going to be absolutely crazy, but if they can put something compelling towards you that tells you, I'm going to do this to try and do this, okay, so go and try and do that, and let them try and do it. If it comes off, just take your hat off and let the awesome stuff happen. And then we move on to the third priority, which is stick the landing. So whether the Cronus is perfectly, or whether Cronus is repaired and it locks its location onto Mother, it locks its next destination as Earth and starts moving there, and the players have to decide whether they're going to try and destroy it or let it happen, whether the Satilla does come into play and there's another option, another twist in the story, whether Clayton starts trying to manipulate things and creates conflicts between non-player characters and player characters, whether the infection spreads because nobody's taken any inoculations, or they have all taken their inoculations and they've all failed their survival checks on it. Whatever this happens, whatever series of events take place, roll with it and land it, because now, after all that work, after all that build up, and after showing these players around this awesome RPG system, now we need to stick the landing of the story so that at the end of it they're out of breath, they're looking back and they're going, okay, what's the next mission that we can play? And that's how I would run Chariot of the Gods as a one shot for either conventions or for your group of players around the table of an evening when you have 1 week, or you have a GM who's away or sick or has other plans, and you're able to step up and showcase a really, really smart, really compelling RPG in 4 hours. The whole point of this is that it's got to be fast. The whole point of this is that it's got to be compelling, and without shoehorning people, they still have decisions. The decisions they're having to make each time can be life and death. So you need to keep the pace in there with stuff like the T- countdowns. You need to build the mystery with the pings and the nobody's home, and then with Mother coming online, and with the messed up information Dr. Cooper or Johns is going to tell you because they have amnesia. All of that stuff, you just need to be drip feeding it, and then by the time we get to the third act and aliens have been encountered and the thing's all gone really badly, all of your players can try and play out their personal agendas in the best way that they see fit. If you've liked the video, like and subscribe. If you want to get involved with the Alien role-playing game, there's a link down below, and I hope to see you next time.